Hi, it's Madison there, and today we're just going to be looking at the buy and sell agreement itself. And of course, we cannot cover every clause, but just to touch on some of the most important ones. And I think sometimes buy and sell agreement structures go wrong because these buy and sell agreements are not put into place and clients don't understand them properly. And that's why policies get structured incorrectly and all sorts of things. Now, this buy and sell agreement is very important because it is the actual guiding document of what happens where the policies are taken out or whatever the case may be. So we're just going to be touching on some of the clauses today. So in sticking with the theme of Mr. King and Mr. Green, we know that they own shares 70-30% split in Zimele, which in turn is worth 10 million rands. Now we know that Mr. Green wanted to buy out Mr. King in case of Mr. King passes away. So we decided then to put together a policy which is going to fund that purchase if Mr. King passes away. So having given you that quick synopsis, we know that now the parties that are involved in this buy and sell agreement is going to be Mr. Green and Mr. King. The company is basically just a target company where Mr. King and Mr. Green will be buying and selling these shares. So party A is going to have to be Mr. King and party B is going to be Mr. Green. Now, the important thing of identifying the parties is that, say, for instance, Mr. King did not own these shares in his personal capacity, which in our case he does. Say, for example, he owned that 70% stake through another entity. So by way of illustration, let's assume that Mr. King did not own the shares in his private capacity, but rather through a company, a PTY, in which in turn he later owns the shares 100% in that company. So there is Mr. King over there. So in this scenario, Mr. King owns 100% of the shares in which this company in turn owns 70% shares in Zimele. In this scenario, this means that Mr. Green, in order to purchase Mr. King out in event of his death, is that the agreement is going to be between the company and Mr. Green. However, the life assured is going to be Mr. King. For simple reasons, Mr. Green can obviously not take out life cover on the company because the company cannot die in a sense as natural persons. However, you can take out a policy on Mr. King's life, who in turn owns shares in this company, so that if Mr. King passes away, it is then his death is a trigger event in order for the company to sell those shares, 70% shares, to Mr. Green. So it's very important to identify the parties very early on because it also has different tax consequences. But for our purposes, we'll stay with Mr. King as the individual shareholder. The second thing why it's important to have a buy and sell agreement in place is, although we have a policy on the life of Mr. King, so that Mr. Green can receive funds in order to effect the purchase of his shares on Mr. King's death. But that's a separate insurance contract. So the assurer will just simply pay Mr. Green because he's the beneficiary the way we've structured it. And then Mr. Green, in a sense, could do whatever he pleases with those funds. So if he decides that continuing in Zimele is not worth his time, he could take that 7 million rands cover and buy whatever he wants, buy a Ferrari, whatever. So how do we create an obligation? It is through this buy and sell agreement, so that once on the passing of Mr. King, once the assurer pays Mr. Green those funds, it is this buy and sell agreement that obligates Mr. Green to now approach the executor of Mr. King's estate and say, these are the funds in lieu for the shares. So it's important to have that obligation created. Oftentimes, I find that people put the policies in place, but there's no contractual obligation actually created. And that could cause problems down the line on whether a buy and sell agreement even existed or not. Now, the third thing that's quite important that is dealt with in the buy and sell agreement is the actual purchase price. Now, just factually, we know that the company is worth 10 million rands and Mr. King's shares are worth 70%, which means 7 million rands. Now, if we know that the purchase price of Mr. King's debt is 7 million rands, that means the policy that we take out must at least cover that amount of money of 7 million rands. You will any shortfalls over insurance, and we'll discuss that on the next discussion. However, so that purchase price will basically be driven by the actual people who are involved in Zimele. It could be a figure that was gained from the auditors, perhaps, of the company. They need to evaluate the company and say, this is what we perceive our company, this is what we think our company is worth, and in our example, it's 10 million rand. So that figure is driven by the actual company itself. Now, of course, companies, insurers will look at things like financial statements to try and figure out if that value is justified. But that's up to the actual individual insurers to do that kind of underwriting. However, for our purposes, we're going to take it as 10 million rands because that's what drives the amount of policy cover that we're going to need. Now, the other important thing is about the value of the shares is it's important to peg it in the actual buy and sell agreement, because you can imagine once Mr. King passes away, there could be arguments about how much the company is actually valued. You know, some might argue it was worth 5 million rand so that they can buy his 70% shares, you know, for a cheaper price. There could be all sorts of arguments. So that policy, so that buy and sell agreement, it has to peg a value so that it's so much easier to determine what kind of policy or how much the life cover on that policy, in our instance, should be. So in our example, in order to cover Mr. King's shareholding of 7 million rand, we have taken out a policy where the owner was Mr. Green, because he is the one that's going to need the funds on the passing on Mr. King. The value of that policy was 7 million rands based on his shareholding. The life assured is obviously Mr. King, so that on his passing, that 7 million rands pays out to Mr. Green. The payer of the policy is obviously Mr. Green, and the beneficiary is Mr. Green, who, once receiving those funds, is going to pay over to the executor of Mr. King the 7 million rands in order to have those shares transferred over to him. So that was the basic policy structure that we had used. Now, there could be instances where the policy is, for example, too low. So instead of using the 7 million rands, let's say the policy is only 3.5 million rands. Now, how do we actually cater for that in the buy and sell agreement? Now, I'm not too concerned about the reason of the shortfall for our purposes, but for our purposes, let's just use one example. Let's say the cover that we could get for Mr. King was not actually the 7 million rands desired, but we could only get a maximum cover of 3.5 million rands from an insurer. Now, that could be based perhaps on his health. You know, insurers might not be prepared to offer him more than 3.5 million rands. So in that situation, we then have a shortfall, because we're saying we enter into this buy and sell agreement. We know that the shares are worth 7 million rands, but we only have a secured amount in terms of a life policy of 3.5 million rands. So in those cases, the buy and sell agreement should ideally cater for those shortfalls where, for instance, Mr. Green could pay the shortfall of the 3.5 million rands by raising funds through other means. You could approach financial institutions, for argument's sake. It doesn't mean that if we cannot hit our desired target by the life policy of 7 million rands, then we cannot do the buy and sell agreements. It could be a whole host of reasons why that is so. So as long as the buy and sell agreement caters for that, then the buy and sell agreement will work out for the sake of estate planning. The other scenario that could play out is what happens if there is more than 7 million rands cover taken out on Mr. King's life. Let's say, for argument's sake, let's just double it. Let's say the cover taken out on him was 14 million rands. Now, again, that can cause all sorts of problems. How we've structured it so far is for estate duty not to be payable on the policy on the death of Mr. King. So the minute that you overshoot the value of his shares by quite a margin, then you run into problems, because then you'll fail one of the requirements which I discussed in Part E of state duty consequences of these policies. The purpose of the policy must be to buy Mr. King's shares. If that is the purpose, then it should be 7 million rands. So if you've overinflated it, then you're transferring wealth, which is actually not for the purpose of a buy and sell agreement. Therefore, the exclusion from a state duty will not apply. But have a look at Part E. We are going to detail around that. So have a look at this example. If for example, let's say for whatever reason that the cover has stayed at 14 million rands, however, the shares are actually worth 7 million rands. Now that whoever the insurer is would have paid Mr. Green the 14 million rands. And because the buy and sell agreement says that 14 million rands must be paid over to Mr. King in lieu of the shares, that means that if the Commissioner of South African Revenue Services determines that the shares are actually worth 14 million rands, I will then decide to tax the whole amount of the 40 million rands, because the purpose of this policy was not to buy the shares, because the shares are only worth 7 million rands. That puts Mr. Green in a bit of a problem, because although the 40 million rands came to him, he however has to pay it over to Mr. King's estate. And Mr. King's estate is great, he's happy because they gave him the value of the shares at double the price. However, just from a pure estate duty perspective, barring other problems, then if the commissioner determines that the value of the business is actually supposed to be 7 million rands, and you basically inflated it, he could decide then to charge estate duty on the 14 million rands. And just to use a worst case scenario, I'm just going to multiply it by the estate duty of 20% and not worry about the abatement and all of that, just to keep it simple. Now that works out to be about 2.8 million rands. Now, Mr. Green would have received, you remember, the funds 14 million rands and paid it over. Now, SARS, in terms of Section 11 of the Estate Duty Act, will collect whatever estate duty is due as a result of the payment of that policy from Mr. Green. So basically, SARS will want this 2.8 million rands from Mr. Green. And if Mr. Green has it, great. But if he doesn't have it, it's going to be come into a bit of a problem, because remember, he does not sit with that 40 million rands. The buy and sell agreement says that needs to be paid over in lieu of the shares. So in order to avoid all sorts of fights in terms of policy being too overvalued or too undervalued, it's important to track those values of the shares of the company and make sure that the policy ties closely to that value. Another nice clause to have in a buy and sell agreement is what happens if the company Zimele, for example, liquidates or is sold, and basically Mr. Green no longer needs that policy on the life of Mr. King. However, he still owns it. What happens in that instance? Those instances can be catered for within the buy and sell agreement itself. So now we can bring in the idea of cessions in terms of the policy that is no longer needed. So let's assume, for example, this whole entire structure is gone. For example, the business has been sold or the business has been liquidated, whatever the reason is. Now, what we're left with is this policy of 7 million rands. Now, in terms of this policy, Mr. Green, who needed the policy for buy and sell purposes while the company was still in existence over here, now no longer needs the policy. So in order to handle those situations, we could have, for example, a clause, a cessions clause that says, because Zimele, the company, has ceased to exist, not by virtue of Mr. King's passing away, because the buy and sell agreement will handle that. Mr. Green will simply buy the shares. But let's say, for argument's sake, it's been sold or been liquidated. Now, Mr. King, because he's the life assured, he could ask for a cession of that policy from Mr. Green, so that he now becomes the new owner of the policy. And with him taking absolute cession of the policy, he remains the life assured, and then obviously he could take over the premiums as well. because now it's his policy, and he could nominate, for argument's sake, let's say his wife as a beneficiary. So that allows for the situations where the, there has been no death. However, the policy is still of value. Instead of just purely cancelling it, Mr. Ging purely cancelling the policy, he could look at seeding it. We obviously not going to cover all the different clauses that go into buy and sell agreement, but I think it's important, just even if it's a template or one you've done before, just to go through it, each and every single clause in there, because sometimes clients might even want to change particular clauses. But just to familiarize yourself, because sometimes policies are structured incorrectly, who the payer is, who the beneficiaries, and so on, with dire consequences, such as tax consequences, simply because they don't have a guiding document, such as the buy and sell agreement, which they can evaluate or review in order to make sure that everything flows smoothly at the end of the day. So I encourage you to have a look at those different clauses. Let's engage around the different clauses, but they must be looked at, because it's actually that agreement that drives what the policies should look like. I hope it helps, but we can discuss other clauses in the future. Thank you.